All right. So, hi everyone. My name is David Finnegan, speaking to you from Stockholm, but I'm originally from Ireland. Uh, I've been working in product tech for almost 15 years with teams of all shapes and sizes. And I think by this point, it's really fair to say that I've been around the block a few times. Recently, I switched my focus fully into facilitation and created my own business, Jumble, which helps product teams get the most out of their skills and techniques. And the skills and techniques I'm going to cover today. So really, what are we going to talk about today? So in this talk, I'm going to walk you through why I actually started facilitating workshops and the realizations that made me go all in. I'll explain how I define a workshop, share tips on how you can supercharge your facilitation. And for those of you who are just getting started, we'll cover some first steps you can take on your own facilitation adventure. And of course, I'll reveal what I feel is the heart of facilitation. Put it another way, we're going to explore how you can get more done in less time and actually enjoy doing it. Sound good? Let's jump in. So my story started out as just a general designer. Early in my career, I did what many of us do, and I just tried a bunch of different things: graphic design, web design, illustration, print production, etc. I was finding my footing working with different clients, pretty simple projects. But really something wasn't right. I felt like I spent way too much time discussing my work rather than actually doing it. I was in a world of multiple revisions, feeling that we were all just really guessing what we should do, and there was just no structure to any of it. So I figured I must be doing something wrong. I knew I wanted to do great work, and I just decided I must not have the right skills. I must need to specialize. If I just get really good at something, everything will just go smoothly. So I became a UX designer, which just made sense at the time. I wanted more structure. Surely being user-centric, testing things with real people would mean that eventually everything would just clear itself up. It would just be easier. There would be no guesswork, no gut feel. I was convinced that sort of being user-centric would just make everything more straightforward. And if I could start doing that type of, I could just start doing the type of work I wanted to, right? Yeah, not quite. In fact, the bigger the team or project got, the harder things seem to get. We ran into issues of all shapes and sizes like these. It didn't really seem to matter which team I was in or which business I was working with. They just seemed to keep on creeping up on us. But another way, complex problems kept on bubbling up to the surface that technical skills alone really just couldn't overcome. The result is, again, we spent more time discussing problems than really working to solve them. So I figured we must not have the right process. Just having the skills wasn't enough. I found myself still struggling with this lack of structure, wondering why we need to spend so much time discussing things rather than actually doing them. So it must be how we're working. There are all these examples out in the world, and conferences and blogs of great processes you hear about. It just must be that. This is what I figured at the time. So whenever the opportunity came up, I jumped headfirst into a new type of process, design thinking, lean, agile, scrum, you name it. I was like, yes, I'm there. Let's do it. Let's try. And around that time, I was also starting to experiment with my first workshops. This was maybe like 8 years ago now. I actually remember my first workshop, and it was a UX workshop where we were doing user story mapping. I remember just putting it together out of frustration because the work I was doing at the time was just so reactive. I barely had like 2 weeks ahead of myself in terms of knowing what to do. And I could never really do effective research. I could never plan on what I was going to learn about ahead of time. And I didn't really think much of this at the time, this first workshop. I certainly didn't see myself becoming a full-time facilitator. And looking back, I can really see that the session was a hot mess. But increasingly over the coming years, I found myself doing more of these interactive sessions when I felt like meetings just weren't cutting it. I needed something more to get moving on my work. I was very focused on myself. So processes, they were kind of good. Workshops, they were doing stuff for me, but I was still kind of feeling a bit, skill processes mattered. Some worked well, others not so much. But it added the structure, some of the structure I was looking for. But they also seemed to leave some people blocked. We got faster in some places and slower in others. Even when processes seemed to be working well, whenever a complex process a complex problem that our process wasn't equipped to deal with would rear its head. Back to meetings, repetitive discussions, no structure. It happened less, so that was a win, I suppose. But I really just couldn't leave it there. There had to be something else. So I figured, hey, it's clearly not in the delivery mechanism. It must be upstream. We must not have the right strategy. So I knew skills mattered, but they weren't solving this problem I was feeling. Processes helped, but they didn't solve the problem I was feeling either. It must be upstream. It must be the strategy. So down the strategy rabbit hole I went, and yeah, I kind of felt like this, I kind of naively assumed that, hey, like the grown-ups are up here doing, they all know what they're doing. And really it was just even more complex problems. I finally had my seat at the table and I was just like shocked to realize that these sort of problems were just really so much more pronounced at a leadership level. There was less structure, there was less clear processes. And to make matters worse, everyone was way too busy to do anything about it. Decisions just took way too long. They were done under time pressure. And despite this, when we actually did nail down a good strategy, it really did enable teams to do really great work. So it was important, but I just couldn't understand why it was so hard. Why did it require so much discussion? Why did it require so much time in everyone's calendar just to solve these? Well, I felt should be straightforward. We should just be able to align on them. But this kind of led to something of a realization, skills mattered, the right process was important, good strategy was crucial, but we were bogged down with these complex challenges. And the realization was that the meetings we were having were the filler, specifically the unstructured meetings. They were what happened when we didn't know what else to do. When there were gaps in our skills, our processes, our strategy, the things that make making decisions easier, things that make everything smoother, then we would just fill that gap with unstructured, repetitive meetings. The default was just these unstructured discussions when we didn't have the vocabulary or the skills internally. We didn't know where to go. Well, let's just talk about it. Let's just try and figure it out. At that point, I had another skill. So I say, hey, let's just start workshopping these instead. And this realization set me off on this path that I'm on today, running my own workshops for companies of all shapes and sizes. Workshops were different to meetings because they allowed us to bridge that gap. Rather than just fill it up with endless discussion, we were able to actually cross a bridge, 4 hours, maybe two back-to-back sessions. We're able to quite quickly move over that process. But by now you might actually be asking yourself, what is a workshop? And I think that's a good question because this word's quite a loaded word. It means a lot of different things to a lot of people. So let's switch gears for a while, because I think it's important to get this for me to explain how I define it, how I approach workshops, and how I think about them today. Because I think that it will help you understand how they might fit into your businesses as well. So really, one way of thinking about a workshop is that they're a micro process which can fit in and around your existing processes. They're not something you have to just commit to whole hog. They exist inside your bigger day-to-day processes and systems inside your business and teams. Now you can use them to break away from the norm and do something completely different, or you can just use them to augment your existing process and make it more effective. But really, they're just this small moment of small structured microprocess inside this huge, bigger system. They're also a form of structured collaboration, specifically to make decisions or solve problems. Really, the best workshops do both. And generally, I'm talking about high stakes decisions, like what's our strategy for the next year, or complex problems, like what should the next set of features in our product do, or how should we best manage the stakeholders for this project. This structure allows us to bring differing perspectives, and we break down and see, and by breaking down and sequencing things, sequencing the way you make decisions and solve problems, you actually reduce the complexity of making those decisions in the first place. We'll get a little bit more into how in a moment. But really, they're just a tool, and they can really be used for kind of any situation where a group of people with differing opinions need to make decisions so they can all go in one direction, go from pointing in multiple different directions with competing objectives. to all going in one direction together. They create alignment in groups that might have conflicting opinions or goals. So this is broadly how I think about workshops today. It's how I explain them to people that I'm working with. But how? Well, to start off, we use sequence discussions. So the facilitator, when discussions decides when discussions should and shouldn't happen, for how long they should happen. This ensures that we stay on topic throughout the workshop. We don't jump ahead or start rolling back on discussions we've already closed. So for example, a facilitator might jump in to stop a discussion if we start to jump ahead to ideation or problem solving when we haven't even framed the challenge yet. And by doing this, we reduce the sort of waste that comes with ideation on a challenge that hasn't even properly been defined yet. Then we use visualized note taking, and we do this using Post-its to ensure that we don't forget important pieces of information throughout the day when we're working together, because it's all being visualized in a standard way rather than everyone writing in their own little notebooks and taking it in their own handwriting. And these could be Post-its in a real workshop and an in-person workshop, but you can also use tools like Miro or Mural, which are digital whiteboarding tools, to do the same. And why we do this is because it allows us to not only standardize the way in which we share our thoughts, it means we don't have to remember everything we've already tackled. In a typical meeting or discussion that spans an hour, there's a lot of different data points that you need to try and remember. And generally, we only remember sort of the start of the conversation, the middle of the conversation, at the end, at best. If we forget about something, we're not sure about the input we had earlier in a session, we can just go back. We can look at the physical representation of the thoughts that have been shared by visualizing the notes we're taking. This is not just a great tip for workshopping, by the way. This is just a great tip in general. Often when I'm having just a one-on-one conversation with someone remotely, I'll have my own little digital whiteboard open and I'll just start taking notes in case we need to pull up the discussion we're having to reflect on it. And here, the role of facilitator is just to ensure that we're keeping things to one idea, one Post-it, just so that there's not confusion when we refer back to them later. The next thing we do is we time box. We time box almost everything inside a workshop. Time constraints encourage people to keep their thoughts brief when they share them vocally, and they force us to prioritize mentally. The facilitator in sessions is always managing the timers, keeping track of how people are doing in the process, where we are in the process, how much time we need how much time we have left across the entire time frame. To make sure that we actually have time to finish everything we need to do. Sometimes this time boxing can be a little bit uncomfortable for participants as well, but usually that's just a sign that your time boxing is too aggressive. You're trying to do too much in one session. So just make sure to leave plenty of time in your schedule to allow for small overruns at each step in the process. That'll make it a lot more relaxed. Also, during these times, it's really nice to stick when you're to sort of frame things with music. If you're working quietly, which brings us on to our next one, together alone. But this is somewhat counterintuitive, and it's something that most people are not used to in their day-to-day life of meetings and working with one another. But it's a large part of what we do when we're in workshops. We work together, but we do it alone. And what this means is we spend a lot of time focusing on writing, sketching, and reading without crosstalk. So we set a timer, 5-10 minutes, and we put some music on, and we focus on reading other people's ideas, generating our own, sketching concepts, those sorts of things. And it's really important as the facilitator that you focus on keeping the silence here, or as much as possible, because even small distractions can cause someone to lose their chain of thought. And really, we want everyone to have as much focus as they can when they're generating ideas, sketching thoughts, or even reflecting on what other people have shared. But together and alone, really, really important. The next, we use voting instead of discussing. So instead of lengthy open discussions that sort of veer off in all sorts of directions, we express our support for the thoughts and ideas that are being generated inside exercises with dots. We like something, put a dot in it. And the reason we generally limit discussion throughout all of these steps is to ensure that we can all share equally. Open discussion tends to favor more extroverted people. And it also creates a lot of bias in the group. It could be that you have your boss or leader in the group. There's a very common bias called sunflower bias, where once you're a leader or someone with influence says something, people just tend to sort of flock to that person. They follow them. Yeah, that's great. Even if they don't agree with them, they'll just. So by generally limiting discussion, we actually remove several biases. We remove groupthink because you have to think individually, share to the collective. And the final one is we make decisions. It might sound obvious, but indecision really is the biggest enemy of progress. So throughout a workshop, we make decisions and then we move on. And this is to ensure that, this is just to ensure that like we can actually say, hey, okay, the challenge we're trying to solve is this, or the goal we have is this. And that trickles down into the rest of the session. And to share this efficiently, every workshop that I run, I recommend you start doing this too, has a decider. If you're in a product business, it could be a product lead or the most senior stakeholder in the room. Really, that's someone that has clear delegated decision-making capabilities. And crucially, the decider needs to be in the room for the entire workshop so that they get the full context of all the decisions full context needed to make all the decisions, to make the right decision. If they're just popping in after an hour of work and saying like, hey, okay, what are the ideas I should vote on? Okay, I just picked that one. They might miss some really, really, really important context as to why that is important. They can't be in the room, then they need to give someone else decision-making capability for the rest of the session. Right, so that's how I approach workshops. That's how I define them. Broadly, how I run my sessions. So let's pick up where we left off. So I was running workshops, whether or not it was for design or strategy. I was really feeling quite satisfied with myself at the minute, pleased that I sort of found this solution to the challenge that I had, this problem I'd been feeling the whole time. Seeing that workshopping facilitation was the answer I'd been looking for to structure the work that I was a part of. Feedback was great. Teams were more excited about working together, about doing more workshops. It was a super great result. And I had the tools needed to unpick these sort of complex challenges that had been blocking me, blocking the rest of the team as well. The more workshops that I did, the less snags I hit in the preceding work that came afterwards. And it was simple. We'd kick off new projects, the right workshop, we'd align, we'd scope, we'd idea and decide, and then we get back to work. And then if a new complex challenge popped up, we'd workshop that too. For everything else, there's meetings. And I want to stress there's nothing wrong with having meetings, but for complex challenges with lots of moving parts, perhaps it's better to consider a workshop. Bring a facilitator in to ensure that you move forward and actually make decisions rather than spinning your wheels for weeks and then taking a decision under duress. So let's think about why they work so well. I boiled this down to sort of 4 points. The first is that workshops save time, and they do this in 2 ways. First is by focusing on a single problem in a time constrained manner, whether it's 4 hours or full day session, just focused on this is the challenge we're trying to solve. You're just going to be quicker because you're not switching context every hour or every 2. You're not getting pinged on Slack or checking emails and losing your train of thought. But more importantly, I think, is they actually proactively save calendar time, meaning you have your outcomes sooner. You're not kicking the can down the road and making decisions until the last possible moment when you absolutely have to make it. Imagine what it would look like if every decision was made weeks in advance rather than at the last possible minute in your businesses. Next, workshops have structure. They have structure to the way you work. They reduce distractions so that you can be your most efficient, and they limit messy open discussion that we're used to in meetings. They invite decisions rather than repel them. delaying decision really does stymie progress in all shapes and sizes. And it's not even big decisions a lot of the time. It's also a lot of small decisions can often need to go around the entire house just to get made. When really like that decision's in the rearview mirror, that decision's insignificant when you have progress to show people. Really, I think the main reason that I found workshops working so well was because they pushed us to collaborate. Most processes just structure how we work. The work itself should be done. They don't really structure how we work with each other, at least not at an individual level. They don't encourage teams to solve problems together. Certainly not on a lot in any sort of focused manner. Maybe you do an hour of ideation or an hour of prioritization a week or every 2 weeks with your team, but generally there's a lot of walled gardens where your focus is your thing, whether or not it's design or development or strategy, whatever you do in your job. There's these sort of walled gardens that appear in teams of all shapes and sizes where, hey, I'm responsible for this thing, so I'm just going to go and do this thing, and you do your thing. It's important to have those capacities, but this sort of like shared common ground where we actually collaborate and begin to build this mutual trust and understanding that, hey, they're not just thinking that they don't just care about the design looking nice, they actually care about the product working well and the business achieving its goals. Like, it's really important that you collaborate effectively with your team to actually recognize that they actually really care about what they're doing. And workshops gave us that structure where we were all expected to share as equals. You could suddenly see that this person that you've never spoken to in your team really did have great ideas. They weren't just sitting there coding all day, not thinking about the product, just getting requirements in the backlog. Even for really dysfunctional teams, with the right facilitation, they were able to come together really quickly and solve more problems than they ever could otherwise. So I think really collaboration was one of the main things that sort of came out of this. It was perhaps a little bit unexpected for me at the time. So you might be thinking then, all right, job done. The answer to all your career, what I'm telling you is the answer to all your career problems and business challenges is just start facilitating workshops. High fives all around, right? Well, not quite. There was still more to learn, of course. By this point, really, all I've been doing is using them as sort of a problem-solving tool, a way to unblock myself in sort of context of the teams that I was working with. They were accelerating a product or a project or even a business that I was already part of. But as my work started to go from this to this, where I found myself working with teams I wasn't embedded in, facilitating workshops for them, for the challenges that they were facing, I realized that just the workshop itself wasn't really enough. Just facilitating 4 hours or a full day session wasn't really enough. I'd still do the prep. I'd run the workshop, summarize, but then I'd hand over to the team to do the rest. I basically like jumping out of a moving car. I'd accelerate the project, and then hope that just this workshop had given the team enough to run with. And often, a few weeks or a few months down the line, they were back to their old to sort of the default standard unstructured meetings, undoing decision taking too long. So I started to think about how I could address this. And that brings us to the title of today's talk, which is what I now see as the heart of facilitation. And really, it's the team. The team's really at the heart of facilitation. As I moved from being inside those teams to being an external facilitator, I realized that my role was to give to the team. I was only really there to guide them along the way to overcoming the challenge that they had at hand. And this might not sound like a huge revelation, but I promise you that realizing this had a huge impact on how I structure my services, and how I eventually structure my business. But why did it matter? Well, because I'd been focused on the process, the workshop, on making it as good as it could possibly be inside those 4 hours that we were working together. making sure the decisions were great and the outcomes of the workshop were the best that they could possibly be. I kind of missed that, what was happening outside, because I'd always been part of it. It just doesn't, but really when you start stepping outside, you realize it just doesn't do enough. So let me explain why with an example. So this is an outline for a design sprint. Many of you will already know what the design sprint is, but those of you who might not, it's a 5-day process, which was created by Jake Knapp whilst he was working at Google and then later Google Ventures. The purpose of this process is to quickly give you data on ideas that you might have so that you can de-risk innovation in your business. Now, there is more to it than that, but effectively you're going from mapping a challenge to prototyping and testing in a 5-day span. And there's a lot of variations to it too. A lot of people take a little bit longer. They've expanded the process, iterated on it, but this is the original. And I'll keep that up. I'll leave it, keep it brief for today on what the design sprint actually is. But now what I want you to do is imagine what would happen if the design sprint just ended on Wednesday. So the middle of the process, we'd mapped out the challenges, sketched the solutions, decided on what we wanted to do. Sure, you'd have some nice decisions, but then what? The team would just default back to how they usually approach prototyping and testing. And for many businesses, prototyping and testing isn't something that gets done in a day or 2 days. 1 day prototyping, 1 day testing. In some cases, a prototype could take a month to produce. In some businesses, testing could take 6 weeks. And this is why processes like the design sprint are just so much more effective than these sort of conventional workshops. Because it does simply more than just align a group or solve a problem. The team creates a prototype together, making the ideas and decisions tangible. They then go to get feedback from real people. They get actual data back on what's done on everything they've aligned on. And most importantly, I think it does all this fast. It doesn't take, it's not a 8-week cycle to get some insights on an idea. Really you can get there in a week. These steps, these 2 steps that are not workshop focused, not facilitation focused, they bring the whole process together. They make it more valuable in the individual workshops that happen inside. But in another way, it leaves the team with more than just a decision. Workshops are these tiny moments inside these huge organic systems. And while more effective alignment and decision-making will make any team more effective, great facilitation, I believe, is about leaving the team with more than that. You're not just facilitating the workshop, you're facilitating a process which exists in the context of an even bigger process, the day-to-day work. So with that in mind, let's run through some examples, things you can do to supercharge your facilitation. So preparation really is key to an effective workshop. But generally, people think to themselves like, hey, what do I need to know to make this workshop, to design this workshop correctly, to facilitate it well? But instead, ask yourselves, if you ask yourself, what information do I need to bring to this workshop for the team? You'll be able to see that pre-studies could be the answer. So for example, let's say you need to do some strategy work. You got a strategy workshop on the cards. It's not uncommon for leadership teams to be somewhat disconnected from customer insights. Perhaps they have some internal business analysts providing quantitative data, but it's very common, in my experience, that leadership teams very rarely see qualitative customer information, customer research. So if you're doing, and really customer research is super important. Customer insights are super important to good strategy work. So what that leads to is teams being too self-referential. What's worked before? What does the data say? They don't really ever hear the voice of a real person saying like, hey, this doesn't work for me. I'd really wish it did this. There's no real insight. So maybe like the solution here in this example would be to do customer discovery. This could be interviews where you actually speak to real customers for there briefly. You could survey them, process some of that data. Or you could just do desk research if they're sort of pre-revenue businesses like early stage startups. But really bringing that element, and this is just one example, of course, but bringing that element into and then presenting it at the start of the workshop for people to align upon gives them a lot more than just expecting them, me as a facilitator, just expecting them to bring all their perspective. Because of course there's going to be gaps there. So the next way you can supercharge your facilitation is through prototyping. Prototypes are really powerful artifacts which help us trigger our intuition. They create a representation of everything you've aligned on inside your workshops and ensure the team is something that can continue to reference beyond the sort of whiteboard, pictures of a whiteboard or a mural board, perhaps long into the future. And it fills the gaps. These prototypes fill the gaps that sketches and notes leave in your mind. And they create even tighter alignment. And then when you say prototype, many of you probably think, hey, okay, I mean a clickable, prototype, digital prototype of a website or an app. But that's not necessarily the only type of prototype you can do. You could do like a physical mock-up of a product, 3D printed, or even just its packaging, a mock-up of a social post or a magazine ad, or even some sort of rough video ad. If you're doing something more marketing or communications based, it can be really effective. Or even you could prototype a sales deck for certain challenges. Prototypes really just are a way of making things tangible for the team that you're working with, and they give them something to they give them a physical, like a real artifact that they can refer back to beyond just the notes and sketches that you've created during the workshop. And there's research and validation. Now, this is a really tricky one because often in a process, research comes way too late. Validation too. This was, in fact, this step was part of the reason that Jake Knapp created the design sprint in the first place, because generally people were taking way too big risks before getting any sort of validation. Often they were building the entire product before they actually got any sort of validation of the idea was even any good. So adding research and validation to processes that you're facilitating and ensure that you're providing important insights to the team that lacks them, and it allows them to refer back to them as they continue to make decisions beyond the end of this process. But research can also happen between workshops. So often it's not too uncommon to do a back-to-back design sprint. So you do two back-to-back. You take the insights from the first design sprint, feed them into the start of the second one. You iterate on it based on new insights so you can make new decisions. You can identify new challenge areas. It massively increases the effectiveness of the work, of the ideas, the decision making, because you're bringing new perspective that didn't exist even just a week ago. But it doesn't just have to be research with, doesn't just have to be like user research or prototype testing. It can also be competitive analysis, going away and analyzing what our competitors are doing similar to this, right? These ideas that have come out of this workshop. Or you could go away and do market research, broader market research, and what people want based on the things you've aligned on. Research can really accelerate the process itself, but it also accelerates the team who needs to run with the outcomes of the session that you're doing, process that you're running. Then remember to documentation and reporting. It feels a little bit dull to recommend that like supercharging your facilitation, is about documenting and reporting things, but really good documentation really not only gives the team something they can revisit when they need to, it also gives them something they can socialize. So remember, you're not working in a vacuum. Everything after this process, and everything goes back to normal after this process ends for them. they're going to need to go and present the outcomes of this process to their stakeholders. They're going to need to get buy-in. And if the reporting and the documentation isn't clear as to why these decisions were made, it just increases the likelihood that some stakeholder who doesn't feel like they're involved enough is going to say, but I don't really agree with this. Let's change track. You make it airtight, like make it make sense. It's so much easier for the team to take that, do the rounds around the business, explain it to people. A great report documents the whole process that you've been through, and it can help the team a ton on their onward journey. You may even want to include observations and recommendations for what you think they should consider as time goes on too. And then the final tip for supercharging facilitation is coaching and support. By the time most processes wrap, you'll have a lot of valuable knowledge and expertise that the team may still lack, especially if you're doing these things like prototyping, researching, pre-studies. But often facilitators, whether or not they're internal or external like myself, can sometimes they just sort of go, hey, okay, see you later, bye, we're done. But really, like what I realized is ongoing support and even coaching can be incredibly valuable in helping the team monopolize on the outcomes and really get the most out of them long after the process has ended. And it's not to say that every facilitator should be doing this. Like it's totally understandable that some people need to switch context, focus with other clients, focus with other teams. Totally understandable. But if you can add some degree of like ongoing engagement with a team, it's really going to level up the outcomes they can get, because they can get, hey, I was wondering, what would you do if you were iterating this prototype? Well, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? It can really create a sense of sort of, like it reinforces the buy-in the team has on decisions over time, and urges them to continue to move forward on the path that you set out together. It can be really impactful. But one thing I think you should remember here is part of what makes this approach so effective is the speed. With all these steps, great facilitation, great workshops are about embracing progress over perfection. It's about figuring out the support and the gaps that you can fill for the team where they need it, not just doing something for the sake of doing it. And if you're lacking the time to do these things, you're an internal team or product team, or the expertise to provide these sorts of things to your team, yourselves, or internally at all, perhaps just consider bringing in experts who can take those responsibilities on for you. There's no shame, like there's no harm in bringing in someone external who can just offload all those responsibilities and sort of accelerate your team. This is how I approach sort of supercharging my services, and how I believe you can approach supercharging your facilitation too. But perhaps all of this is a little bit too advanced. Maybe I'm jumping the gun a little bit, and maybe some of you in the audience are just thinking like, hey, yeah, this all sounds good, but like, what do I do to get started? So as we run into the end of this session, let's actually look at that. How do I help people get started in their own facilitation journeys? How can you get started in your own facilitation journey too? So I would recommend starting out with what I call atomic workshops. So this is about taking the individual atomic elements that make workshops great: speed, exercises, structure, sequencing, and applying them to existing meetings that are already happening in your business. So first step of atomic workshopping is to structure your meetings. Plan the agendas, what you're going to do. How much time are you going to talk about the first thing in the meeting? Second thing that the meeting's about. Third thing the meeting's about. How long is the meeting? Is it 60 minutes? Are you discussing 3 things? Well, maybe then you should time box each discussion to 15 minutes. And then plan the outcome. Plan what decisions you're going to take at the end of the meeting. And tell people But that's what you're here to do. Set that objective in their mind when they're coming in. You're not just here to have a coffee and a chat. You're here to actually decide something, plan to create an outcome. The next tip for atomic workshopping is sequencing your meetings. Solving complex challenges, it takes time. And instead of just trying to replace all your meetings with workshops, believe me, that won't work. Instead, you can try sequencing your meetings. So in the same way I explained sequencing discussions in workshops, you can sequence your meetings too. So you focus on solving the component parts of a broader decision. So if, for example, you're trying to define the challenge, if you're trying to define the challenge, focus there first. Don't invite people to jump into solutions and ideation. Say, hey, we're going to deal with that later. This is the framing meeting. We're just framing the challenge at the moment. We're just aligning on the goal right now. And if you have a weekly meeting or a bi-weekly meeting, once the first meeting ends and the second meeting starts, refer back to what happened in the first meeting. What decisions were made? What was discussed? Use elements like visualized note-taking to ensure that you have actual records of what's happening along the way. And then the final element of atomic workshopping is adding exercises to your meetings. You can keep this really simple. I actually have two examples to share with you today. The first is called a note and vote, and it's a really simple exercise. So you should know what the meeting's for, why you're having it. So spend the first 5 minutes, set a timer, spend the first 5 minutes working together alone on just generating ideas or thoughts on what you should do, what everyone feels you should be discussing in the meeting. Then spend another 5 minutes just reading everyone's notes, everything that's been shared, and voting with dots. Give everyone 2 to 3 dots each, depending on the, maybe a few more if there's not many of you in the meeting, but there's a lot of you. Try and keep the number of dots small. And then focus on the top voted items the rest of the meeting. This will bring a lot of focus and you'll really be able to see that you're taking things off the table. You're sort of framing a discussion for the rest of the session. It gives you permission to say like, hey, okay, but we said we wouldn't discuss that today. And someone really has to justify why they want to put it back on the table. If the rest of the group has already sort of indicated, hey, this maybe isn't the right way to do what we're here to talk about today. The next exercise is a sailboat. I'm assuming many of you are familiar with this from running retrospectives. But I'll run through how to run it. I'll explain briefly how to run it. So we know what our meetings are for, right? If we're setting our agendas and we're structuring them, planning for a good outcome. Spend 5 minutes generating what's pushing you forward to whatever this meeting is about. What's holding you back from getting there? In the next 5 minutes. Then another 5 minutes voting on the things you need to address. In terms of what's holding you back. Focus on the things that are holding you back. And spend the rest of the meeting discussing how you could resolve the top voted things that are holding you back. Just adding this structure will really level up your meetings. They'll make collaboration just a little bit more straightforward. Because generally when we work together, everything's just a little bit messy. There's nothing that's off the table unless someone explicitly says, oh, but we're not here to discuss that. And that feels dismissive because you've never framed the discussion. Doing exercises like these can really help frame up those discussions and have much more effective meetings. So maybe you're doing this for a little while, starting to build that sort of collaborative language with one another. You're sort of ready to start running bigger workshops, maybe 2 hours or 3 hour sessions. But you maybe don't know where to start. And once you sort of implemented atomic workshopping, it should be easier to justify to people why you want to get 2 or 3 hours of their time in the middle of the day. But you don't need to design your own workshop, thankfully, because there are tons of great resources out there, what are called recipes in the workshop design space. but for many of you, you can just call them templates. So all I'm going to do for this section is just run you through a couple of really great examples. Here's some great books. Design Thinking Playbook has loads of great exercises and great workshops that you can run very easily. Visual Thinking has lots of very illustrative exercises that you can fill out together. Gamestorming has loads and loads of really fun activities that you can do together. And then Designing a Better Business and Service Design Doing are more sort of process focused. So you'll need to do a little bit of extra work to translate those into a workshop, but they're great resources for solving complex problems. But maybe you don't want to buy a book. Maybe you just want to look online. Maybe you're not ready to make that sort of commitment yet. So thankfully, there's also a bunch of fantastic resources online, such as the Miroverse. This is from one of the online whiteboarding tools. Loads of great resources there. There's Boardle. This is a great place just to find Miro and mural boards from other fantastic facilitators. There's workshopper.com. Has lots of great tools on improving your facilitation and workshopping, but also loads of great recipes and that you can use to use in your business. Or just something like the Design Kit, which has smaller or larger activities, which is based on design thinking from IDEO. And the final step, I would say, in sort of getting going with all of this is finding your cornerstones. So once you're comfortable sort of running smaller sessions, start figuring out what the sort of cornerstone workshops are in your business. The recipe that your team will use quite frequently to solve a recurring complex problem that you currently don't have a process for. And they're great because they allow you to get a lot of reps in on a single process. So it's really about what workshops do you need the most, which challenges pop up the most frequently, which ones lack a clear structure when you're moving through them. So for example, I spent a lot of time working with startups a number of years ago. So a cornerstone workshop at that time for me was the value proposition workshop, because that was something that most startups were missing. They weren't considering product market fit that much. Value proposition workshop was a quick and effective way to get them through that. And then the final tip on this is to start with problems you understand. You don't need to sort of jump into sort of doing a design sprint if you don't understand what's happening in there. If you're an expert in product strategy, but your team the team around you struggling with it, think about how you could structure a workshop to step them through the process that you really understand already. So you're helping them to understand something that you already understand very intimately. So let's wrap up. We'll get on to questions. I think if there's 3 things I would say you should take away from this, I'd like you to take away from this, I think would be these. First of all is meetings fill gaps where workshops create businesses and create bridges. So gaps emerge when complex problems show up in our processes that the day-to-day process just isn't equipped. The meetings fill those gaps like a vacuum, whereas the workshop allows you to create a bridge over that, resolve it quickly and move on, get back to the day-to-day. Second, workshops save time and encourage better collaboration. They structure how you work together and make decisions and solve problems. And will reduce the feeling of teams working inside walled gardens. And finally, think beyond the workshop to supercharge your facilitation. Consider what the team needs, what they're lacking, what information would accelerate them either inside the process or beyond the process. And they'll love you. So that's a talk, but I'd love to connect with all of you. So here's my email, my LinkedIn, or if you like, you can just scan this QR code. It'll take you straight to my LinkedIn profile. If you want more tips on facilitation, workshopping, and product team efficiency, you can connect with me on LinkedIn, where I share tips and tips like these Monday through to Friday every week. And anyone who is interested, just reach out to me in the email or on LinkedIn. And I've got I've got some free boards, workshop boards, and exercise templates for you. These are usually only available for people who do training with me, but figured I'd share today. So that's the talk. And now I would like to open the rest of the time up for questions.
Awesome. Well, thank you, David. Yeah, let's we have about 10 minutes, so you can either go off mute or put your question in the chat.
Don't be shy.
Maybe David, while we're waiting here for people, could you talk just maybe about repetition in the sense, like a lot of times people are intimidated to start, and how important is, I think, just in general in communication, that it's okay to mess up, but it's really about getting comfortable with just conducting workshops, facilitating to get better at it. So I'm interested, like, what's your perspective on that? And then Juan has a question. We can come back to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think really the message I would take one of the messages I try and take away from it is that actually what this is about is it's about lowering the stakes of decisions. So you can make decisions more quickly. So it doesn't matter as much if you make a bad call, right? You're breaking the decision down in component parts, but you're constantly realigning as you go through. And the team is there, the facilitator, and hopefully the facilitator to sort of get you back on track. But ultimately, like the time efficiency and the sort of focus that you're bringing to the session, you can just repeat it if you feel like, hey, if you learn something like, hey, okay, we didn't really get this right, stakeholders weren't into it, or the users didn't really feel it. That's great information too. So like getting things wrong or messing up or making a bad call, like that's just part of the process. And I think that fear really drives like a lot of it really drives a lot of indecision and a lot of sort of paralysis in businesses. It's just not that big a deal in the grand scheme of things. I'd rather make 5 bad decisions and 1 great one than spend the same amount of time making 1 really mediocre decision.
Which goes back or goes to the feedback loop, shorten the feedback loop. So getting the 5. Yeah. Great.
Exactly.
Juan has a question here. I've seen that voting still drive people to the same stickies after the voting starts. What alternatives to that voting are you using to support decision making?
Yeah, I mean, there's always a little bit of bias to dot voting. I think it's overpronounced. I think there's one of the techniques I used to use, I don't use it as much anymore, is I would set a timer for people to read first. I would ask them to decide what they're going to vote on. And then after that timer ends, then they would vote. I think, I can't remember which tool it is. I also think it might be Miro, but I'm not 100% sure because I don't use the smart meeting features, but there is actually features there, features in one of them that allows you to sort of only reveal the votes after the voting has taken place as well. So that might be another solution. But I think it's kind of overpronounced because it's kind of an overstated challenge. It's something that I used to think of that was a really big challenge. But really, if the quality of ideas and the stakes of decision making is high enough, I mean, people are going to vote the way that they think is correct. And I think it's important as well to select the right participants who have strong opinions about what you're doing, rather than just sort of saying, hey, let's bring like 20 or 30 people to this session, where 20 of those, half of the participants really couldn't care less what decisions you're making.
Great. All right. So we have a couple more questions in here, and then we have Benoit and Eric with their hands up. So let's see if we can get through a couple of these in 6 minutes.
Okay, how
to resolve ambiguity or assumptions through facilitation?
Yeah, I mean, there's always ambiguity and assumptions, whether or not you're facilitating workshops or not. I think a lot of it is just leaning into it, because often it's easier to build intuition about whether or not you're making the right call at the back end of a process. So at the point in which you visualized your ideas and created real solutions, it's much less ambiguous what you're suggesting, because you've all aligned around a specific idea or solution. You've all voted like, this is what we're actually thinking. We actually are all kind of aligned on thinking that this is the right call. You actually have something much more visual, much more clear, rather than sort of trying to remove ambiguity at the start of the process. That said, if you notice ambiguity when you're speaking to people, or you notice that they're making a lot of assumptions, pre-studies are a great way to prepare. But also just referring over materials, looking through materials that they've created can be really effective as well. Just to learn a little bit more about the client, you can sort of say like, okay, but this is kind of an assumption. After that, go get validation, go test things.
Exactly. I was going to say, like, a lot of times I would just use simple hypothesis statement and say, like, how we're going to validate this assumption. So that's something. Okay, so let's switch it back a little bit to Benoit and Eric. So Benoit, you go first, and then Eric, and then we'll see if we can cover one more.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Really nice seeing you, by the way, David.
Nice seeing you too.
And it's a really nice presentation. I like the way that you organize everything and just build up. And it's a nice way to explain what we do, which is kind of complicated sometimes. So I liked it a lot. The follow-up with the coaching is something that I didn't thought about. So it's a really good idea to follow up and to basically keep on working with people. So that's another big plus for me. Something that I was thinking about, maybe it's the week for that, but AI could be used for prototyping. I'm not sure if you are using it for quick prototype, but it's something that I'm trying to work with. I don't know if anybody is working with that. So.
AI is something I'm very interested in. In terms of design tools, I find them quite lacking. I found the AI to be quite lacking. I don't generally do prototyping myself. I usually work with someone else who does prototyping in sessions, and they're very interested in AI too. My general feeling on sort of like those tools is that most of them are features, not products, and they're just waiting for someone like Figma or Adobe to integrate it somewhere and actually do it well. Right now, they're kind of a little bit meh. ChatGPT is kind of interesting for like gathering input or getting perspective as well. But again, I think like a lot of AI right now, if you're actually an expert at something, it's usually pretty slow. It actually slows you down a little bit. That said, if you're sort of not you're sort of in you're intermediate or just getting started, like I think they're fantastic tools, and I 100% think they're going to have a massive impact on this way of working, and probably going to reduce the time that a lot of these things take as we move forward, but probably not this year, maybe like 2025 or something like that.
We'll see. Thanks.
Yeah, we'll see. Thank you.
Eric?
Hey, David, thanks. Great stuff here. Real quick question. I come from a very heavy meeting-centric organization. So what would be your recommendation to start off a workshop, with my group or a couple of teams?
Yeah, I think like honing in on like problems that feel high stakes so that there's buy-in to do them well is always useful. And then if you have like, if you kind of like satisfied, or if the people are kind of satisfied, or it's the done thing just to have a lot of meetings, just start implementing like structure, sequence them a little bit better, and add like the atomic workshop elements that I talked about. Add exercises occasionally, and then build up to doing bigger workshops. But one of the things I think that like, and I know I run a business doing this, so I'm obviously going to say this, but I think bringing in external people for really big challenges, it can be super helpful because it just shows how it's done at sort of an elite level. And then people are like, well, why are we not working this way? And then like it makes buy-in a lot better. Like, oh, okay, they ran a prototype something in 2 weeks and tested it and gave us and iterated it. Why can't we do that? And it's usually not a skill thing. It's usually more of like it's how you approach it. A lot of teams are sort of self-interested in things like, okay, design has to take 2 weeks. It can't possibly be done in a week, in a day or 2 days. So like just bring it, I would say, like if you're really in a really heavy meeting-centric place, bring in someone external for a really high stakes challenge and show them how it's done.
Deal. Thanks, David. Appreciate it.
All right, David. Got a couple more questions, but let's just time box them to like quick 30-second responses. So Williams says, my biggest issue is members of the meeting are on their laptops. Every question statement has to be repeated 2-3 times.
Oh, that one's an easy one. Just tell them not to make sure they close their laptops and put their phones away at the start of the meeting.
Just setting up expectations, and by the way, right, it's a lot easier to set the expectations at the beginning. It's weird to bring it up in the middle of the meeting when you haven't set it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Just start of the meeting. Hey, we don't need our laptops today. And if you're remote, hey, let's focus for the next hour. It just gives you permission to address it.
Okay, great. Shelly has a question. I've had some people tell me that they've had bad design sprint experiences, or just that they don't have confidence in the process. Do they have wrong expectations, or what do you think some are doing wrong in design sprints?
This is not going to be a 30-second response. I can maybe talk about this in the break if that's easier.
Okay.
Cool.
Let's see.
I'll come back to that one.
16. Yeah, let's I'll let me just share my screen. So we'll take a 15-minute break.
Cool. And I'll quickly address Shelley's and then Masab's question, and then I'll jump off.
So 15-minute break. At 2:30, we'll have Pat in this main room, and Teddy is gonna be in the breakout room B. So, all right. So if you want to listen, feel free. Or if you want to take a break, that's fine as well. And
Cool.
David, please continue.
Perfect. Thanks. So Shelley, in terms of like people having bad experiences with design sprints, I mean, there's bad experiences everywhere. I think it's just. I think one of the reasons that the people go into the design sprint and get like underwhelmed is because they sort of fundamentally misunderstand why they're doing it. They try and go in to sort of like create a working prototype that they can start developing straight out the gate, rather than like with the idea that it's just to sort of start the process. It's just to start the design process. But also, bad facilitators are out there. I think one of the things that really is challenging about the design sprint is it's so the prototyping and research is so different to a typical prototyping and research process. It's almost not the same thing as a typical design or typical research process. You get a day, or in some cases 2 days to prototype and to do research. Most people would tell you that these things can take 4 to 6 weeks. And if you bring in a designer or a researcher who has that mentality, who doesn't see it being possible to do prototyping, in that time, they're just going to create something mediocre. So there's a lot of ways that they can do. And sometimes it's over expecting from the session, but I think it's not a silver bullet process. People use it too much for too many things. It's best at de-risking innovation, and then you can push further afterwards. Okay, and
thanks, David. I know that was a big question for to answer, but I thought maybe when I hear this, maybe it's just they have wrong expectations, or probably the things you suggested.
I would say so. And then last question before I jump away is from Masab: how to resolve conflicts between decision maker and the experts. I think that's really a setting expectations type challenge. So we're telling people up front to trust the process, and we're telling them that, or we're explaining to them that we are going to defer to our decider, and you're asking people to agree to those terms. So like, hey, is that cool? Still, it does happen occasionally where someone's like, no, but this is the wrong decision. In that case, what I would do is I would just time box their justification of why it's the wrong decision, give them 30 seconds just to say, hey, I think you should consider something else. And then I would defer back to the decider and say, okay, based on what so-and-so has said, do you want to sort of change your decision, or are you happy to stick with where you are? And if they're like, hey, I'm just going to stick with where I am, that's it. Then the person just has to deal with it, because we respect the role of the decider in the session. If it escalates beyond that, then I kind of have to go outside. Hey, this is not cool. We need to move forward. Sometimes it happens, but then you get into runs to like handling troublemakers and those sorts of things.